Hello, hello. I know we have some people just trickling in. Awesome. Well, I know we are at 5 o'clock Pacific time now, and I know that we have a very packed agenda today. So let's go ahead and get started. But hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our session, Echoes of Partition Healing Intergenerational Trauma. We are so happy to have you join this very important discussion today. I'd like to start with just a few quick introductions. So, my name is Nisha Udine, founder of South Asian Care. I'm grateful to host this session today and am joined by a wonderful panel of speakers. So, on our panel today, we have Dr. Amara Khalid, author and psychotherapist. We have Munira Zaidi, therapist. Mrinal Gokhale, author and community storyteller. Ranjit Singh, community advocate and member of We Are South and Punaf Rahman from Virtue Mental. We're here to explore not just what happened during the partition, but how its emotional and psychological echoes live in us today. When our grandparents or parents experienced violence, displacement, famine, loss, or betrayal during the partition throughout the Indian subcontinent, many of them didn't have the language or support to process it. So when the pain, fear, or survival strategies of one generation get passed down through stories, behaviors, beliefs, and even nervous system responses, what impact does that leave to the generations after? So we'll have a lot of different types of conversations, discussions, and questions today, but I'd like to just start off by asking two of our panelists a quick question. When you think about the legacy of partition, what emotions or themes feel most present in your own story or work? Dr. Kelly, would you like to start us off?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for being here. This is a very personal topic for me. Both sides of my family migrated during the partition. My dad's side of the family migrated from Delhi to Karachi, and my mom's side migrated from Lucknow to Karachi. And I think that, a lot of us may have grown up hearing stories about the partition while others may have not. And it's one of those events that, there's a lot of history books written about it. There are books on politics and sociology, but no one has really examined the impact of the partition from a psychological perspective. And initially, I had just started out to do some research to understand how intergenerational trauma as a family therapist might impact South Asian populations. And so I started to do research and quickly realized that there really wasn't much there. And that's what prompted me to start writing a book about it. And I'm bringing it to you with Jessica Kingsley Publishing. Hopefully next year. My deadline is this year. I have to get it done by June. But it will be the first of its kind book to examine how intergenerational trauma impacted South Asian families from the subcontinent and how we can break the cycle. So it's a hands-on guide that we can use. So the partition, like I said, is very personal for me, and I've seen so many clients from all walks of life. I've worked with Indians, Pakistanis, Bengalis, Afghanis, Sri Lankans, Burmese families, and they all talk about how the division of the subcontinent impacted them. And you see that there's a lot of similar themes around grief and loss, but also there's a lot of resilience in our families. And I feel like that doesn't really get talked about either. And so my goal is to bring together these stories from four different generations, from those who survived the partition all the way down to the millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, that are trying to understand what still lives within our bodies, what still lives within our psyches, and how we can name that, because I think a lot of us don't have the words, right? Even I speak Urdu and Hindi, and there's some words that just don't translate. And so finding the words to name this trauma is the first step. And then we move into healing and releasing it. So those are just some of my initial thoughts, but I would love to hear from some of our other panelists.
Yeah, I can really also echo some of the things you just shared, Dr. Amara. Thank you so much. Very excited to read your book as it comes out. And I also sort of agree that, like, I think for me, also as a therapist, one of the things that feels really present about the legacy of partition and intergenerational trauma is how it lives really quietly in the silences, the fears, and the expectations that get passed down without being named. So I feel like that language piece of it is so important to not only for us to understand how that intergenerational trauma manifests, but also for our own healing. And I really do see as like a therapist how deeply people are shaped by their experiences that they didn't even live through, but they still carry in their bodies and in their relationships. And I think what stands out is that oftentimes this is kind of how like survival gets passed down as well. These are like coping strategies that many of us learned. And healing is really now asking us to slow down and understand what did we inherit.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you both so much for sharing. And I know we're going to dive a lot deeper into this. So with that, I just kind of like to set the precedence for this, and I will be going through and, asking our different panelists some questions and things that relate to their work. So I'd love to next go to Dr. Amara, and ask just to start off our conversation and learn a little bit more about you and your work. But what does it mean to honor the emotional journey of our ancestors while acknowledging the trauma they carried into future generations? I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. In 2026, we're still having this issue. Um, so I would invite all of you in this moment because before we really get into this topic, I want to acknowledge that it can be really heavy and to some extent it might be triggering, it may be bringing up different emotions, different thoughts. So as we move forward in this conversation, really pay attention to what's coming up for you. Take breaks as you need to. If the material feels like it's too much, that's okay. We just want to be sensitive to where you are in your process, right? This may be the first time you're listening to someone talk about this, or you may have done your own research about your ancestors and your family and their stories. So we just honor that everyone may be in a different spot with this. Take deep breaths as you need to, ground yourself as you need to. And we'll be talking about a variety of things, including some very traumatic histories that people have shared with us. One of the questions I want you to think about is where are you from? What happens for you when you hear this question? Where are you from? It's a question that I had hoped to answer about identity and belonging for the South Asian diaspora. But I think on this journey, what I've discovered is that we need more questions to unpack the significance and the meaning of what it even means to be South Asian, right? The important questions. So the where is not so simple when we actually think about you, like you as in yourself, you as in your family, you as in your ancestors, your people, your race, your culture. The term South Asian didn't even exist until the 18th century, until it was given to us by the British, as people from the subcontinent generally describe themselves regionally. I'm Gujarati, I'm Punjabi, I'm Sindhi, I'm Rajasthani, Hyderabadi, Bihari, whatever. Many of our grandparents and great grandparents still describe their hometowns in this way instead of saying India or Pakistan or Bangladesh. And then the second question I want you to think about is what type of ancestor do you want to be? And this is something that I think about a lot, and I've been thinking about it from a very young age because I grew up around two different sets of grandparents and even great grandparents, and I grew up in a joint family home in Pakistan. So I was keenly aware of the weight of lineage. I knew there were certain values and customs and beliefs that I wanted to hold on to, but others that I wanted to leave behind. So I didn't take them forward in my own family. I also knew that my family was a Mahajir family or a refugee family that had migrated from India to Pakistan and settled in Karachi, which is where I was born and raised. Um, and I think that, even today, even though I'm writing about this history, this book is less about the history and more of a warning for the future because we saw this even in last year that the threat of war between two nuclear countries like Pakistan and India is still very much present. And these stories continue to create new narratives and stories about who we are, how we got here. There are many families like mine who crossed the border and never returned from India to Pakistan, Pakistan to Bangladesh, Bangladesh to India. Some of us know the stories, others don't. Some grandparents may have shared about the horrors that they witnessed, stories about railway platforms being covered in blood and looking for body parts, stories about buses being burned with people being burned alive. There's lots of stories about the gendered violence and the violence that was committed against women throughout this process. A lot of folks couldn't process this trauma, so they repressed it. And what does that say about them as ancestors? Can we even know? And as a family therapist, I think we ask a lot of questions about someone's context, right? Like, where do you come from? Where do your ancestors come from? What do you know about your family? Because things like depression, mood disorders, OCDs, phobia, PTSD, there's lots of acute issues, chronic issues. Some of them may be related to our genetic makeup. Some of them may be related to how we were raised. Some may be related to what things have been passed on a very molecular and cellular level. And other things may be things that we experience, traumas that come in our own life. They could be big T traumas, they could be small T traumas. What I've learned over my 15 years of practice and my own experience and training is that many times the questions we ask are more valuable than the answers that we're looking for. So that's why I really encourage you to kind of think about what kind of ancestor you want to be, because this is really a question that gets to the heart of what do you carry with you and what do you want to leave behind. There may be trauma that is passed down in your family from one generation to the next. There may also be healing and resilience and courage and strength that is passed down in your bloodline. So we can take those gifts that we receive and we can leave behind whatever our unhealed ancestors may have given to us. What a lot of people don't know is that the partition was not just of one single event, right? The partition of 1947 is usually what we think about when we think of the partition, but it actually happened over a course of years. There were actually five partitions, starting in the 1930s with Burma, which separated from British India. And then in the 40s and 50s, you saw the separation of the Arab states. So Oman, UAE, they were also part of the British subcontinent. And then, of course, there was the major partition of India and Pakistan in 1947. But there were also sort of an unofficial partition of the princely states, places like Hyderabad, because they were not really um, part of anything, and so they were integrated into new nations, which kind of formed this unofficial fifth partition. And then the last one, of course, is 1971, the partition of Bangladesh, where East and West Pakistan were divided. So part of my book delves into the history of our colonization, and the impact that some of those events had on us. Before the British came, we had about 400 years of Mughal rule where we didn't see a lot of famine or food scarcity. But the British coming in and their rule extracted so much from us. And we don't talk about this enough because I think we have a lot of mixed feelings about what happened. There's also, I mean, if you read history, history has been written and rewritten depending on who you talk to, what perspective. So sometimes it's hard to understand, how people feel about the British being there. Some people talk about it like it was a good thing. I think even to this day, people feel divided about the partition itself. Some saying it never should have happened. Other people say it was inevitable. Um, some people think the sacrifices were worth it. They speak very patriotically about their nation. Um, but throughout the subcontinent today, you see decades of political upheaval. India's grappling with fascism. Minorities continue to suffer across the region. You see Pakistan in upheaval all the time. You've seen what happened in Bangladesh recently. Um, so there are families who experienced severe trauma before, during, and after these events, and some families who managed to get by unscathed and didn't have much distress. But the this idea that the British were using a simple divide and rule strategy that broke us apart is not quite accurate. There was a very complex interplay of very rushed decisions made by a small group of people that were anglicized, out of touch with the majority of the subcontinent, and didn't fully appreciate how out of control nationalism could become. I think they thought that this would be a drawing of borders similar to the Canadian American border or the Australian New Zealand border, but those happened over time. There was a lot of thought put into that. But the splitting of India happened so quickly that there wasn't enough time to thoughtfully divide anything from shared lands to rivers to the army, the currency, even books in libraries and zoo animals. So we really get the sense that, the British colonizers were just addressed to quickly address the chaos and the lawlessness that was happening in the region. And that's when they very quickly decided to leave and drew up these borders without giving it much thought. So I want to pause there and check in to see if anyone has any questions so far. You could also put questions in the chat if you need to. So, what we saw during this time was the world's largest mass migration to date. Approximately 14 million people were impacted. About 25 million were displaced, and anywhere from 3 million to 10 people million died. And when we think about these numbers, it's just wild that the largest mass migration in our history, and no one has really unpacked the trauma, the families who were separated, children who died in front of their parents, women raped, the the trauma that we carry not only in our DNA but also through the narratives, the stories that were passed down. Many people thought that this move was just temporary and they would be able to go back and say their goodbyes, retrieve their belongings, tie up loose ends. They were told of hopes and dreams where Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims would live in peace, which, of course, as we know now, did not work out the way it was sold. And whether a family was negatively impacted by the partition or not, the years of colonization before it, the famines, the flood, the mini partitions that took place, they all have had a profound impact on South Asians everywhere. So even today, we continue to ask each other, where are you from? Aap kahan se hain? There's a desire to locate the other. And maybe it's a desire to locate ourselves too, because we're people who have consciously and subconsciously been trying to go beyond the where to also understand the why, the how, the when of it all. the chaos of the partition continues to live in our minds and our bodies. And some of our senior family members and elders would share those experiences with us, while others could not bring themselves to articulate the grief and loss and horrors. But what is remembered? What is forgotten? Is it possible that our bodies know what our minds don't? And there are Hindus and Sikhs and Muslim families even today that are still haunted by the massacre of their ancestors. So the stories that I share in my book demonstrate how the partition and the aftermath had a direct impact on the generation of South Asians who lived through it, ranging from PTSD to substance addiction, extreme poverty, malnutrition. The stories from the second generation, so their children, um, speak of extreme stoicism, a lot of silence, growing up in abusive households or with parents who were simply trying to survive and feed their families, and suffering from hypervigilance or scarcity mindset, which is the belief of never having enough. The stories from the third and fourth generations speak more directly about identity and belonging, naming the constant striving for perfection, struggling with addictions, eating disorders, attachment issues, codependency. And of course, as a systemic therapist, I think a lot about the impact of colonization throughout all of this, right? White supremacy, class, patriarchy, caste systems, oppression that shaped and continues to inform many inherent beliefs and values that we still hold in South Asian families today. So we kind of unpack the historical trauma that occurred, the collective trauma that we felt together as a people, and then intergenerational trauma, which refers to trauma that's passed from one generation to the next. And I always give this really beautiful example that when your grandmother was 5 months pregnant, the cell that would become you was in her body because your mom was in her body. So whatever your grandmother experienced at 5 months of pregnancy not only impacts your mother, but also impacts you. And on one hand, it's a very beautiful image of three bodies in one. But when you think about folks who experience trauma and experience such hardship, it's also frightening that how much is not in your control, that things that happened to your ancestors can impact you today. And I don't want this to be sort of a helpless message, right? Because it's really not about that. It's about being able to call it in and name it in order to release it. But we can't, there's such a culture of silence and stigma when it comes to mental health issues in our communities. So we really have to find the courage, the resiliency to be able to talk about these things in forums like these and then be able to release it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Amara, for your impactful words and just for all your dedication to the work that you do. And it's very much appreciated for you to share it today and, for us to continue these conversations. And thank you to those in the chat who have been sharing kind of their thoughts, their experiences. I'm glad you can join us in this discussion as well. For our next area of discussion, I'd love to turn to Mrinal and Poonam, who are wonderful storytellers in the South Asian community. Mrinal is a talented author, and I'd love to start by inviting her to read a brief excerpt from her book. So, Mrinal, I'll pass it over to you.
Yes, hi everyone. The name of my book is Taboo, South Asian Mental Health Stories, and it is an anthology of true stories about South Asian individuals from all across the world that have a story to tell, with topics ranging from mental illness to neurodiversity, neurodivergence to disability to intergenerational trauma, model minority myth, and so on and so forth. And, kind of their journey to mental wellness. And that even though the book isn't like solely set, like hyper focused on intergenerational trauma by itself, the ideology of it does come up quite a lot in these stories. So I'm just going to read an example of a story that does mention it. When Ronnie turned 12, her family moved to Canada following some property disputes back in their home country. Her father lost their money in a bad business deal and could only afford living in a low-income Toronto apartment. Ronnie's parents then told their daughters one thing: study, 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 until they get into a top college to earn a better life. Do not be squandered by boys, parties, or anything else. This wasn't the first time their survival mindset was activated either. Generations before Ronnie were involved in politics in Bangladesh and the independence movement in pre-partition Bengal. It began with her grandparents growing up in the 1947 partition when India broke free of centuries of British rule. In 1971, many of my family were targeted by the Pakistani army. Highly educated people were victims of intellectual killings known as Operation Searchlight. The West Pakistani government didn't want Bangladesh having leaders that allowed us to be independent. Many of my family went into hiding, and my parents were terrified teenagers at this time. Some extended family was killed, and I think it led to intergenerational trauma that never was acknowledged, Ronnie said. When Ronnie began middle school, she was teased for being the new girl and for being an immigrant. However, she did make some Indo-Caribbean and Afro-Canadian friends. Classes were also a bit easier since expectations were lesser than at the Dhaka school she originally went to. She thrived with creative work like projects as she could do them on her own time compared to timed exams. She found that even when she was slower in the uptake, she was capable of learning and retaining multiple types of information. Even though her academic performance was up to par with her own expectations and that of her parents, she constantly had to overcompensate. Her parents would tell their children, "We immigrated here for you, so our expectation for you is good grades," which is something Ronnie later identified as emotional blackmail. Her teenage years, already a confusing time, were exasperated with the conflict of her parents, having to obey an early night curfew when her friends wanted to enjoy city nightlife, not being allowed to date, and the dual critique she was getting from them and from teachers. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much for sharing, Mrinal. And, I just have kind of a few questions going off your experiences and the work you've done. But through your interviews and your writing, what stories did you encounter that revealed the unspoken impact of partition?
It's not that every story what had like a theme regarding partition. This was just one example, and intergenerational trauma isn't like the only thing that came up. However, I will say that, people who did bring up an intergenerational trauma as a whole, they would say that they identified expectations such as really high expectations, having parents that had their stuff together when it came to being financially well off, being married, raising children, but not much emotional maturity. Always being in the survival mindset, not really thriving, always focused on what am I going to do next? How do I pay my bills? How do I pay my bills and then some? How do I make sure my children are well off? How do I get them to get into STEM so that they don't have to go through what we went through type thing?
Absolutely. And in these discussions, do you notice any patterns of silence or avoidance across generations?
Around what?
The partition, any of these discussions within their families?
Yes, in the sense that, when you think of the phrase "loka kahenge," which is what will people think, that is something that came up in my book a lot when it came to people talking about their own mental health related struggles and then the conflicts of things like mommy and daddy won't let me take medicine, see a therapist, and so on and so forth. They'll tell me who's going to want to marry me if they know my mental health is suffering somehow. And I think that that kind of goes off of the idea of not wanting to put your dirty laundry out there, which I do think, which I have read is kind of like somewhat of a trauma response that has been passed down many generations. And I do think that with that comes like, feeling uncomfortable talking about things that happened like 50 plus years ago or like during the partition, for example, that you speak of, because the past is the past. We've moved past that and, it's something sad and people haven't really, I think are not all of our elders necessarily like they knew it happened, but they didn't emotionally acknowledge and process what it means for them, and then neither did their parents, and then that it's kind of just a vicious cycle in that sense.
Absolutely. And Also, in the stories that you collected and heard from these individuals, did you see any kind of reoccurring emotions such as grief, shame, fear, or resilience?
Yeah, I think that resilience is what got these people to a position where they could tell me their stories and I feeling comfortable allowing me to write them publicly like this, even if not all of them wanted the world knowing their real names when I did so. And I think that grief is something that never necessarily goes away and can coexist with resilience in this sense.
Absolutely. I know these are a lot of themes and different feelings and emotions that people feel in various formats in different areas of their lives and family relationships as well. But thank you so much for sharing, Renal. I'd love to ask Poonam a few questions now as well. But Poonam, I know you do a lot of work in South Asian communities as well. How do you see storytelling break shame and open doors for healing in your work?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. Well, I feel like storytelling is kind of a quiet sense of courage because for a lot of people here, our families came, or we ourselves have come from immigrant families, and we haven't really, our parents might not have had those opportunities to share their stories and kind of like put their voices and insights out there. And whenever we hear like other people's stories about, oh, like, their journeys coming to the US or like their experiences post 9/11, we were able to kind of like say like, oh, that kind of like sounds a lot like my childhood or like the experiences that we went through. So I think it's important that we open up those doors of storytelling and kind of create those opportunities where people are able to share their stories of childhood and their experiences coming to the US. And even when it comes to like racial and religious discrimination as well.
Definitely very important. And do you kind of have any thoughts about how we can create that space for the stories our families didn't have words for?
Absolutely. I think it's just finding spaces for like journaling, therapy, prayer, just creating those just like it doesn't have to be like creating like a community center where everyone can like congregate. It can just be like starting within your inner circle and just having those opportunities where people can just like share their thoughts about their experiences in therapy or like their religious experiences and kind of go from there.
Thank you. That those are very, very important suggestions and very, very much agree. But thank you so much for sharing. And, I appreciate everyone kind of sharing their experiences with their work and storytelling. I know storytelling is a very big part of this because without that, we can't share communications and have open dialogue about it. So thank you for the work that both of you do. Before we move on, I wanted to just make a quick note that if things come up during this discussion for our participants and our audience, feel free to put any questions or thoughts in the chat box. I know some of you already have, but feel free to do that throughout the event. And we do have a portion at the end where it'll help guide our discussion as well. So just wanted to make a quick note on that. Next, I'd love to ask Munira a few questions, just kind of about how intergenerational trauma shows up today. But I'd love to start by asking, for those who didn't live through the partition, how can someone tell if they're carrying inherited trauma?
Yeah, and thank you. And I also want to just start by acknowledging how meaningful it is that we're all here gathered to have this conversation because partition is often spoken about as history, but I think for many of us, like you said, like who haven't lived through it, um, it kind of lives really quietly in our families, in our relationships, and even in our bodies. So when I think of intergenerational trauma, I'm really talking about the emotional, psychological, and physical impact of that trauma, both in our family systems and in the historical and political context that it gets passed down from in one generation to the next. So, yeah, because many of our parents and grandparents, they lived through displacement and violence and famine and loss during partition. And they often had no space, like we just said, to have no space to talk about this or process what happened or even language to share about their experiences. I think for many of our ancestors, survival was the priority and expression was not. So instead of trauma being spoken about, it became really embedded, I think, in our family rules, expectations, silences, beliefs, and nervous system responses. So, we always see like what gets passed down isn't always the story, it's the adaptation of the story. And I'll often say in some of my work with clients, it's that we didn't inherit the event, we inherited the survival strategies. So I think that some of those things are ways that it shows up for us. And examples of that could really look like hypervigilance, like always waiting for something to go wrong, we're constantly scanning. It can also look like perfectionism or the pressure to be the model minority, where safety really feels tied to achievement or being good enough. And they often say, we often hear that phrase, that Marino just also mentioned. It's like, what will people say? Right. So clinically, I really see that term more culturally, because I think of it as a way that communities were trying to stay safe and maintain belonging in a time when visibility was really dangerous. So intergenerational trauma can really show up as also emotional suppression, guilt, even around making choices for ourselves, mistrust of other communities within our Indian subcontinent, or even physical symptoms like anxiety, chronic tension, fatigue. Many of us might have even heard our parents make comments when they were stressed that their blood pressure is going up. And I oftentimes think of that as like a psychosomatic symptom, even that sometimes is passed down. So, yeah, I like to acknowledge that it's not like a character flaw or personality trait. I think sometimes these are really nervous system responses that are shaped by our history. Um, and many ways that we can kind of start recognizing this inherited trauma is really by noticing when our reactions feel bigger than the moment that we might be in, when fear doesn't also match our current reality. We can also ask questions like, when did this begin? Is this feeling mine? Is this pattern mine? Or is this something that I inherited? And for many people, there's also relief in realizing that this didn't start with me. So I always think that that awareness also helps create choice, and it also helps break that automatic survival mode that we might be on.
It Didn't Start With You is the name of a book too.
Yes, that is so true. Mhm.
I know you touched a little bit on the different areas, but do you have any advice or suggestions for some ways that people can begin breaking or softening these patterns that you have seen in, whether it's emotional suppression or perfectionism, mistrust, or some of these different areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for a lot of us, healing the intergenerational trauma involves learning our personal boundaries. But I think that that topic also, comes up with a lot of guilt. And so, for example, like we may feel bad saying that we can't attend a family event, or we might have to learn to say no to family members or people in our lives regarding a request they're making, but also have to sort of coexist with the guilt that we might feel around that. So I think part of the work around healing this is learning that boundaries are not rejection of the other, but really oftentimes they're about like a really loving way for us to end a cycle of self-abandonment without ending the relationship. And I also want to note that because the trauma also lives in our body, the healing for this experience, I think, and breaking these cycles also has to include the body. And I think later in our conversation, I'll talk with Dr. Amara and we'll share some more grounding tools that can be helpful for, working with our emotions when we're feeling overwhelmed, or even when we're feeling really numb or disconnected. So I see oftentimes either of those two things kind of happening. Um, when we're working on healing and softening and breaking these patterns of generational trauma and healing. So we'll definitely get back to that piece of it. And but I just want to also end on noting that for many of us, this intergenerational trauma might have felt really internalized. But I want to remind everybody that this is not our fault, and that the healing of this, though, can be our legacy. And when we choose awareness, compassion, connection, we can really become the generation that transforms survival into possibility. And I think that there is a lot of opportunity for all of us to sort of really learn from our ancestors and now learn how to move forward in a really hopefully positive way. So
Thank you so much for sharing, Munira.
thank you.
Next, I'd love to ask Ranjit a few questions to share a little bit about community perspectives. So, Ranjit, I'll start by asking, what kind of us versus them narratives or biases do you see amongst South Asian communities today?
Hi. First, I definitely want to thank you. Thank you for having me here, and thank you all for coming. This is definitely very important that we're having this and we're doing that. And to say that my background, we're a South Mental Health organization, and I have a background in DEI and multiple certifications in it. I'm not a therapist, even though I have been mistaken for that a few times. Just want that I am not a therapist. When it comes to us versus them and cognitive biases, in a region as divided and fractured as South Asia, there's a lot of hate. Like, we're no stranger to hate. There's everywhere hate. And whether we've gone through the partition or descended from partition survivors, or whether it's people who didn't go through, it's all just hate. And we really have to look at how this happens, because for most people, their perspectives on things are the first things that they are taught, which we're right, we're the victim. Other people are responsible for our problems. They're going to get us. We need to get them before they get us. And we don't know what other views are. We just know to oppose and hate other views. And I do compare this to Pavlov's theories of classical conditioning, the guy who rang a bell to train his dogs. Some of us, we are trained a similar way when we hear some different views or some words of different views to immediately feel threatened and to get triggered into fight mode. And this is constantly reinforced in school, media, family, and our acceptance and belonging may even be attached to believing and perpetuating these narratives. And that creates neural pathways in our brain that makes it much harder to change. And with these and with that, it really harms our like our mind, because the way we start to look at things, we look at them from a viewpoint of does it fit our biases, that anchor bias, the first thing that we bel you're taught to believe, because that's super easy to believe that, and a lot of bad actors know how to manipulate that bias. And we have so many other biases in just how we interact with each other, cognitive biases. And I do want to say a bias is not limited to someone's automatic identity preference being different from our own. A bias is a mental shortcut, and there's so many kinds of that. One of the most common ones we have is the ad hominem bias, attacking the person instead of the argument. And another specialty in the community is the straw person argument of intentional misunderstanding, exaggerating, changing the argument. And all of our assumptions are actually biases, because assuming is easier than understanding. And that makes assumptions are biases. And to remember that, the first three letters of assumption. And and it's also so easier to falsely to accuse someone of being against us or believing in hate and to personally punish and traumatize them for it than it is to successfully turn around a uh, a confirmed person who does believe in hate. And we add this to the trauma mindset, where we have some people using this disobedience as, are you trying to kill me? And this creates the perfect storm that we're in. And this system, it's not an accident. This system is working exactly how it was designed. And that's the first thing we need to recognize, the radical acceptance. This is the mess that we're in, and realizing that is the first thing to working on that. And we have to go back to how it happened, like the British colonized us, because we know they came to steal our money. what they needed, how that work was, they needed us to hate each other to have those divides so they can take our money. And they were afraid that we would throw them out. We came close in 1857 during World War II. We had government of Indian exile, and that really scared the British. And if we threw them out, that would have ended their views of white supremacy. So what they did was they decided to give us independence, and they left the region fractured. That way we couldn't be united and hold them accountable. We would be fighting with each other. We would be competing to get them on our side. And a lot of these colonial divides of hating each other, that actually is continued in modern South Asia by politicians and in some countries the armies, because they do the same thing. They want to steal our money, and the only way they can do that is by making us blame it on our neighbor. And we fall for it because it's so easy to believe that. And these are things we need to question. Why are we hating these people? How are they really responsible for it? What are the people in power actually doing? And we need to start looking at our own views before we talk about is someone else right or wrong.
Absolutely. Sorry, were you going to say something? I didn't mean to
I
jump
was
in.
I was just gonna, and this one was kind of like I have my formula for like dealing identity-based biases because again, we're all taught like our part of South Asia is best, our country is the best, our region is the best, our city is best, our language is best, our religion is best, and it's all the others who are the problem. And to look at these biases, we have to look at, this is my formula to dissect it. How did it start? Who benefited from it originally? How did that get passed down? How do the beneficiaries changed? What are the new ways it gets reinforced? The people we're taught to be biased against have the same bias against us. What would happen if we stopped believing these biases? Who would lose from it? The bad actors who deserve to lose from it? We really need to just dissect our biases and figure out why do we even have these?
Definitely. And have you seen any kind of shift when individuals confront these inherited narratives?
And it's confronting these narratives is actually very, very difficult because what I see here is individuals is they bring these sentiments from South Asia to here and bring hatred here to America, and it seems like discussions are like the comment section on a news story where people are just going at each other. And I see people just getting very offended, like I said, when they're exposed to a different viewpoint. And I do cite an example of an incident I had where someone decided my identity and decided that I'm not a real minority, and this was a person far more privileged than me, decided I wasn't a real minority, and that person decided just minority on their confirmation bias. And when I was speaking up, this person immediately would interrupt me, shout at me, accuse me of being biased, and make up fake news and attack me and try to humiliate me in front of my peers when this guy barely knew anything about me. But this guy thought he was advocating for diversity and fighting to end hate when he was only perpetuating it. And these things really need to be replaced. Like we need to have conversations to build community. Instead of making a conversation difficult, let's have the difficult conversations to unpack serious matters. And it's not about winning or losing or debating or showing off your confirmation bias or claiming you're an ally. It's let's share what our views are. Why do we have them? And hear others out. What their views are. Why do they have them? And remembering that there are so many ways to look at it, given how diverse South Asia is and how complex intersectionality is. There's more than two ways to look at an issue. There's more than one solution because people are going to have different views for different reasons, the same view for different reasons, and different views for the same reasons. And we don't really know that until we have that conversation and we figure out what these individuals' viewpoints are. And we have to remember that nobody is perfect. We all make mistakes. Even I do that too. Nobody is perfect, so we really can't do the trauma mindset of demanding perfection or punishing imperfections. We need to have that awareness to realize that, and what we really want to make sure we're doing is just making sure we're presenting what in a way that makes people empathize with our stories, with any group we want to be an ally of. Like, we don't want to take legitimate human suffering and present it as this is an excuse to traumatize someone to say, I'm better than you, I'm the ally. We don't want to convert human suffering into an excuse for that. We need these issues need to be taken very, very, very seriously. And and when we do that, then we can have our strong communities where we understand each other. Even if we don't agree with each other, we can understand each other. We can still humanize each other and acknowledge our differences, even if we don't agree. We can still move on to work together. And I do want to I was just saying like by saying like as my family went through the partition from Punjab. My dad's family came from Narowal, which is near the border between Gurdaspur and Sialkot, and my mom's family came from Nialpur, now Faisalabad, and Sialkot as well. So I do have that in my family, and I think I look at like I cannot blame people from another country for what happened to me during my family during the partition, anything that happened. Like, we cannot venge out the injustices of the past on modern populations, and we cannot blame all members of a community for its for its leaders and what they do. What we can do is we can come together, get to the root causes of why do we have these problems? Why is this been allowed to happen for so long? And we identify that, we can change that. We can break the system, replace it with a system that works. And it takes all of us, but we can replace us versus them with never again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ranjit. And I really, really appreciate you sharing and contributing to this conversation. And those are very, very powerful points. So thank you so much. Next, I'd like to just take a few minutes for a guided reflection exercise. We have a few prompts to guide your thinking, and we'll put them on screen and walk through them one by one. But as we do that, please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat box if you're comfortable, or jot them down for your own reflection. I will pull them up now. And as we're going through these, I'd love to invite our panelists to comment or engage with anything that is shared in the chat box as well. But this is our first question. What silence did you inherit from your family? And I'll give each question about a minute. So I'll allow people to take some time. Again, put in the chat box if you're comfortable, or you can jot it down for your own personal reflection. All right, we will go to the next question. Feel free to continue dropping any comments in the chat box or taking more time if you need on one question. How has what will people say shaped parts of your identity?
Nisha, can you also put the question up so that people can read it if they missed it?
Absolutely. Are you able to see my screen? Is it sharing?
It's still on the first guided reflection question.
Oh, I think we have a delay. Did that progress? If not, I can reshare.
No, it's still on the first one.
Let me reshare. 2026, but we still have technological challenges. Did that work?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'll just keep it like that. I think that will help with viewing. And I will go to our last question. What would you tell an ancestor who lived through partition if they were here with you now? Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing this reflection. Please feel free to continue. If you still have thoughts on your mind, if you're typing it out, please feel free to drop it in the chat box as we continue forward. But I'll give our panelists just a few moments to go through, and if there's anything you'd like to comment on or any kind of things that you'd like to discuss.
I am just loving reading folks respond to this. It's really, um, it's not something easy to talk about. And I think for a lot of us, we have a lot of pain and grief in our families. Our ancestors, our grandparents, our great grandparents, they may have carried wounds of their own. We may not know the full extent of their stories, but whatever they passed on is something that we can name and honor in this way. Even us coming together here in this webinar, I think is truly a testament to us as cycle breakers taking that step to name things, to honor the legacy, to say, hey, maybe they did do their best, or maybe they could have tried harder. Maybe they could have done something different. But we are here because we believe in taking that step to say, okay, where can I have growth? Where can I have change? Where can I have agency? I think for a lot of our ancestors, especially in the subcontinent, agency has been something that people feel robbed of or people feel they never have access to. And while there are a lot of gifts in collectivist cultures like ours, it can be hard to practice any sense of autonomy, any sense of agency. And it doesn't have to look the same way it does for Western cultures or for white people. Agency and autonomy can look brown too. And so I just want to give everyone that reminder that, boundaries is not just a Western concept. Therapy is not just a Western concept. These things have been around in their own way in our culture for a long, long time.
Thank you, Dr. Amara. Absolutely. Any of our other panelists have any thoughts? No pressure if not, but just want to give the opportunity.
I just also want to acknowledge, that many people brought up in the chat also that they inherited silence and, just want to sort of like recognize like how hard that is for many of us to live with since we don't have spaces that we can talk about this in. So, yeah, I just want to sort of validate that and, say thank you for, for everybody who shared in that, in their experience. And then also some of the messages that we have for our ancestors, or some beautiful ones that were shared in the chat, like "I am your wildest dream come true," and "I honor you." I think that's like really important and special. And I often think about it as an exercise of like, if I could write a letter to my ancestors, what would I say? And I think some of these two messages really kind of captured something very special, to acknowledge that like we are our ancestors' wildest dreams come true. And the fact that we are here today talking about it, um, I think is again so beautiful that we're leaning towards healing the silence and naming it.
Thank you, Manira. And I personally also very much relate to these messages to our ancestors. All right. Well, thank you so much for everyone sharing their thoughts and for our panelists reflecting on some of these discussion points as well. I really, really appreciate it. And please feel free to continue if anything else comes up. But next, I would love to have a bit of a conversation with Dr. Amara and Munira on healing frameworks and emotional tools. Before I dive in, following this part, we'll be having an audience Q&A. So if you do think of anything, please feel free to put it in the chat box now, and we'll be getting to that shortly. Well,
Yeah.
I'll dive in then and I'll start with some questions. And as I ask these questions, Dr. Amara and Munira, I also welcome you to have a dialogue with each other too if anything comes up from your work or your experiences. But I'll start by asking you, Dr. Amara, in your work, what does healing intergenerational trauma look like at a practical level?
So, psychologist Gabor Mate, in his book, The Myth of Normal, writes that trauma is not the bad things that happen to you, but what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. So, this means that trauma is a wound that could be psychological, emotional, and spiritual that leaves a lasting imprint on how you experience yourself in the world. And it can be unconscious and disconnect you from your authentic self. Similarly, trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk in the book Body Keeps the Score explains trauma as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience that overwhelms the brain's ability to cope, integrate the experience, and return to baseline. And he emphasizes how trauma dysregulates the nervous system and it can distort memory and perception because trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint that's left by the experience on the mind, the brain, the body. So we really have to think about the impact on the mind, the brain, and the body, because traumatic experiences are not just psychological, they can be somatic, they can be body-based. Trauma can be stored in your nervous system, especially in your brain's survival systems and the amygdala and the brainstem. And people often will experience body memories. So this could be like a tightness in your chest or different kinds of aches and pains, panic, dissociation, without really having a clear narrative around it. And trauma responses can become stuck, and then the body remains on alert, even when there's no actual danger. And trauma also shapes the way in which we relate to ourselves, which can result in chronic stress, autoimmune illnesses, emotional dysregulation, because we're stuck in that survival mode. So you may have heard about the fight or flight response, but there's actually four responses that we have. There's fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And those are the biological survival responses that are triggered by our nervous system, specifically our autonomic system, when we face a threat. So when we're in fight mode, we're confronting the threat aggressively. So we have anger, irritability, need for control. Whereas with flight, we try to escape the threat. We may have anxiety, overworking, perfectionism. When we freeze, we shut down. So this looks like dissociation or numbness, paralysis or avoidance. And finally, with fawn, this is the people-pleasing tendency to avoid conflict. And a lot of South Asians do this. So this might be where you merge with someone else's needs at the expense of your own. And any four of these responses can become the default mode in trauma survivors, even when the threat is no longer present. So I encourage you to think about how you respond when you're faced with a threat, when you're faced with uncertainty, when you're faced with anxiety. What kind of response do you have? Um, and really think about ways in which it may manifest in your body. Where do you notice it in your body? I invite clients that I'm working with in therapy to do a lot of mindfulness work to just start to become aware of where in the body you may be carrying something. A lot of people think, okay, I'm anxious, so I need to think my way out of it. I need to find the right mantra, or I need to find the right words to soothe myself. What people miss in that is that sometimes these feelings are pre-verbal for us, right? They get stored when we're in a pre-verbal stage, when we haven't reached that age yet to be able to articulate our feelings and thoughts. So how can you address something like that verbally when it exists in this very nonverbal, pre-verbal state, right? Um, so instead of thinking your way out of the emotion, the sadness, the anger, the grief, the anxiety, it's almost like you have to work with the body first. Maybe you have to take a breath. Maybe you have to close your eyes. Maybe you have to run your hands under cold water. Just something that grounds you, brings you into the present moment before you can have the clarity to then think, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm a psychologist. I love talk therapy, but talk therapy has its limits. There are ways in which you need to practice being in touch with your body first in order to be able to talk about all the difficult things. So, if you're thinking about a starting point, um, that would be a really great practical approach. And there are so many apps now that you can download, like Calm and Headspace and other things that have all of these mindfulness exercises, breathing exercises. And we can really use a lot of tools that are part of our culture already. Yoga is part of South Asian culture. Meditation is part of South Asian culture. These are all things that have been co-opted by the West, but we have them at our disposal. I also think using art and music and dance and cooking and food can be also a way to ground yourself. Maybe all you need is a warm cup of dal and you feel right there present in your body, engaging the senses, right? The smell of the dal, the taste of the dal, the texture of it, all of these things that engage your senses. We have such a variety and diversity when it comes to music, when it comes to art. There are lots of different tools that we can use to really stay grounded in our culture and explore those gifts. So those are some ways, and I would love to hear from Wanira what your thoughts are as well.
Yes, yeah, no, I'm right on the same page with you about thinking about our bodies first when we're thinking about healing intergenerational traumas and we're thinking about some grounding tools. Because like you said, we really can't think our way out of fear. And, as much as like, sometimes affirmations and, cognitive reframes, these things can be helpful on the intellectual front, our body doesn't really know the difference. Um, so I really do think that healing this has to involve the body and not just with the insight and thinking about how, your nervous system is activated, right? Like you mentioned the four trauma responses. And I think that's a good way to start is thinking about, well, what do I normally go into when I'm triggered or fear shows up for me, right? Do I find myself in that fight mode and get confrontational? Or do I also go into that fawn state of like people pleasing and enmeshing with someone else's, stuff that they're putting on us. So I think that's a good way to start is definitely looking at that and then kind of go into maybe some grounding exercises. I teach a lot of methods like the 4-7-8 breathing method or the five senses grounding exercise. So I can just share briefly a little bit about those, which is the 4-7-8 breathing can be really helpful when your anxiety is really high. And it starts off with you inhaling through your nose for 4 seconds, holding it for 7 seconds, and a slow exhale out of your mouth for 8 seconds. And that long exhale oftentimes tells the nervous system that the threat has passed. And after a few rounds of this, you'll notice that your heart rate might drop, your blood pressure might begin to slow down. So that's just one example of a breathing method. There's several definitely out there that you can utilize. And Dr. Amar, you were mentioning just like using the senses and how that can be really, really grounding for a lot of us too. I love the example of a good cup of dal because that is very comforting. Um, yeah, but I oftentimes also tell my clients that, like, that exercise of thinking of naming five things that you can see in your environment, four things you can feel, like what can you touch around you, three things you can hear. So just taking a moment of quiet and just listening to the sounds around you. Two things that you can smell, and one thing that you can taste, and accessing some of those things to really gently anchor your body back into a present moment. And I think that this exercise really helps for not just intense emotions that we might be experiencing, but also for numbness and disconnection and disassociation. Because oftentimes when we're in that disassociated state, we're not feeling anything. We don't even know what our body is feeling. Um, and what I love about both of these tools, the senses, using our five senses and the breathing technique, is that they don't really like require you to explain or justify how you're feeling. And they don't ask you to solve either the pain or the distress that you're feeling. It really simply just helps your body get to a safer place, a safer moment, so that once you're there and your nervous system is feeling a little bit more regulated, you can then go on and mindfully think about doing the work that would help your emotional experiences, the trauma that maybe you're experiencing, and help yourself sort of on that journey. So, yeah, I'm definitely, on the same page with you about that, Dr. Amaro.
Thank you, Munira and Dr. Amara. And Munira, I know you spoke a little bit about coping strategies and grounding
Mhm.
tools. And I know, Dr. Amara, you touched a little bit on it, but just wanted to see from your work, Dr. Amara, if there's any other kind of modalities that you suggest or, see to help release this inherited pain.
Yeah, I take a multifaceted approach. So we talked about the mind-body connection earlier. So some techniques you may use might be grounding techniques or body work, could be dance, could be music, things like that. But also journaling, writing letters. We talked earlier about writing letters to your ancestors. You could also write a letter to your future self. You could write a letter to your younger self, which can be a really powerful and healing exercise in revisiting, moments from when you were 5 or 8 or 10. Um, what would you tell yourself about where you are now? What did you need to hear at that point in time? Um, Sometimes writing these letters can be really cathartic. Or you may want to write to someone who's no longer with you. If you are cut off from your family, if you no longer speak to them, or if someone has passed, you can still write a letter. And then I have people who have put that letter into Lake Michigan to sort of send it off or tie it to a balloon and send it away. Some kind of symbolic ritual that helps us release. So there's lots of different ways, and there's no one right or wrong way to do any of this. I think you can be creative with it. I think you can be playful with it. Um, we don't play enough. I mean, South Asians are serious. My God. So we have to bring in some of that lightness and playfulness into this work too.
I love that, definitely. And a question for both of you. How can younger generations set boundaries with compassion, especially when guilt is part of the inheritance?
And yeah, I think that's a really good point to make about the guilt piece of it, because I think that's like such a prominent emotion that shows up for many of us when we're thinking about setting boundaries. And many of us may feel torn between honoring our parents' sacrifices and versus honoring our own needs. And I think a lot of times that internal conflict oftentimes leads us to feeling really burnt out, a lot of resentment, and can lead to a lot of self-abandonment. So one of the reframes that I offer is thinking about saying that the guilt doesn't always mean that you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it just means you're doing something differently. And for a lot of my clients that I work with, and even for myself personally, I try to remember the intention of setting boundaries is around our own self-care, right? So when when we're setting these boundaries for ourselves, it's important to really highlight that when we feel that guilt coming in, because we're going to start to feel really bad that we're saying no, or we're going to start to feel guilty that we're choosing a path that maybe our parents didn't want for us. Maybe we're choosing, maybe they wanted us to go into medicine, but we decided we wanted to be a painter. And, we're trying to really figure out, ourselves in this process, and it might mean disappointing our families. So I think a lot of times, like when we're setting these boundaries, we have to be really compassionate with ourselves and knowing that some really difficult feelings might come up, but it doesn't mean that we are doing something wrong. And I know that for a lot of us, we saw that our parents, our families, like closeness was really built through sacrifice, and obedience and self-silencing. So sometimes we kind of get the wires crossed about love and what does love mean and look like in our families. So, us choosing ourselves to them might look like betrayal. It might look like, we are um, somehow causing them harm, even though that's not our intention. Um, so I think for a lot of us, like when we're setting boundaries, our nervous system actually does interpret that to be dangerous to do at first, even if that boundary that we want to set is healthy. So I really think about starting with that framework of compassion and understanding that, giving yourself that feedback that you're not rejecting your family, you're actually working on disrupting a pattern that can feel really, really uncomfortable, even when it's necessary. So I really encourage everyone to start small and clear and recognize that boundaries don't have to be confrontational. They can sound like, what I like to call like some buffer statements. When somebody's requesting something of us, we can say, hey, I need some time to think about this, or I'm not comfortable discussing this right now, or I love you and, this is what works for me. And kind of trying to sort of also kind of speak to what is our boundary in these like non-confrontational terms. And just as important as it is to set the boundary, as setting boundaries is, it's important to also regulate yourself afterwards because the guilt will show up. And when it does, I remind myself, my clients, that the discomfort of this guilt, again, does not mean that I made the wrong choice. It just means that I'm doing something new. So it's really learning that, setting these boundaries are not about distancing yourself from your family. They're oftentimes about creating relationships that are more honest, more sustainable, and less rooted in fear. So that this can actually be an act of healing for us, not just for our individual selves, but also for our generations after.
And in the interest of time, I'll just add just a few things. One thing is that boundaries are like a warm hug, right? So we need to reframe this idea of boundaries being a dirty word. It's really a warm hug. And please don't get boundaries confused with rules, because you can make a rule like you can't smoke around my child. That's a rule. But a boundary, only you can enforce or break that boundary. Someone else may break a rule that you have, but boundaries, you have to enforce them, right? So it's up to you if you're going to be around that person who's smoking around your child or not. But to ask somebody else to engage in a certain interaction or do something or certain behavior, that's a rule. And I think it's important to distinguish between the two because you are enforcing your boundaries. It's not like they are then breaking your boundaries, which is, I think, often what we hear in the cultural zeitgeist.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amara and Munira. I really appreciate your insights. And thank you to all of our panelists as well. We'll now move into the audience Q&A portion. As I read out questions, I welcome our panelists to respond. So our first question from our chat box. I have severe dysautonomia, dysregulation of autonomic nervous systems, and have been wondering if this could be correlated to intergenerational trauma. There's very limited research on this specific topic, but I was wondering if anyone has more information or experience with this.
Don't have a lot of research on that specific topic, but what I'm hearing is that it's also probably really disruptive if you are having a hard time actually having your nervous system even be activated. I think for a lot of the patients that I've worked with and what I've seen, it's like sometimes you'll also have delayed reactions where maybe an emotion comes up like several days after an event. And I think that when that's something that you're struggling with, like we also have to have a lot of compassion and understanding for ourselves. And also like create systems and relationships where we can always can ask others to or share with others that like, that okay, I might need to take some time to think about what you're asking of me or what you're sharing. And take your time to sort of step back and journal and or talk to a professional or a trusted friend, somebody who you could also process out loud with. Um, and of course, I think that with the nervous system, it is, of course, something that maybe, somatic movements and different things might help navigate, it might help with working out of. But yeah, I can definitely see that being something that could be inherited from intergenerational trauma.
I will also just add that given that our mind and bodies are so connected, there may not be one root cause, there may be multiple things. One example I give is that, there were a lot of famines during this time in the subcontinent, and we've had lasting impact on our bodies as a result. So the way our bodies store insulin and how our fat cells work, there's a reason why there's so much hypertension and diabetes in the South Asian population. So a lot of these things have multiple historical causes. Um, and I think as the field of genetics continues to advance, we'll have more and more answers in this realm.
Thank you. Our next question and comment, I know there's been some engagement in the chat, but if any panelists would like to expand on this, someone said, I'm curious why you all think silence is part of our inheritance. What was the purpose or benefit of this learned skill?
I think it comes down to survival, right? For a lot of people, silence was the way they move forward. You keep your head down, you stay silent, and you keep going. Because for a lot of people, there was no time to dwell on things. There was no source to unload. Everyone is traumatized. Everyone is collectively experiencing so much. How do you process that heaviness? Sometimes you don't. You just move it aside. Um, you know, family secrets in particular, I will say, have um, they have a way of maintaining what we call equilibrium in the family. They maintain homeostasis in the family. So, for example, I've worked with folks where there was physical violence or sexual abuse in the family, but nobody talked about it. Even though everyone sort of knew it's something that's not discussed. Oftentimes that's because the family is agreeing to this unspoken rule that we don't talk about this. We don't call this person out. And there are unspoken rules as well, right? About who gets called out versus who gets a pass. So all of our families have these different rules, they have their different roles, um, and reasons for why silence is sometimes even seen in a very high regard. Oh, isn't it great that so and so manages to get by with so much hardship and doesn't say a word? It's this irredeemable quality almost. And oftentimes the people who talk about the problem are seen as the problematic ones, right? They're the black sheep of the family because how dare you talk about it?
Thank you. Our next question. Is it possible to heal without knowing the full story of what our families went through?
There's also ways in which to sort of explore. For example, I've worked with folks who were adopted and they didn't know what their biological parents were like. Some people have gone through like ancestry.com or done the 23andMe DNA testing to see where they actually come from. Um, so whatever information you do have, you find, if you are cut off from your own family of origin, there may be uncles and aunts or other people in the family, cousins, our extended family can also be a source of information and resource. So there's lots of different ways to reach out and find information if you aren't able to have the one-on-one direct contact.
Thank you. And in the interest of time, I'll ask one more question, but how can communities move from shared pain towards shared resilience?
Think also by having conversations like this, right, where we are naming the trauma, we're acknowledging the history, we're acknowledging the impact of that history, and um, creating safe spaces for all of us from all different backgrounds of like the Indian subcontinent to just be able to speak about our personal experiences um, without blaming and judgment, and actually kind of trying to also share our stories for building empathy amongst each other and also creating connection in our communities. So I think that, just having conversations like this also is a great way to build that bridge.
Thank you, Manira. If anyone else has any thoughts or questions, I encourage you to reach out to our wonderful panelists, to have your conversations. I know they're available and willing to continue this conversation after the session as well. But as we begin to close, I want to thank each of our panelists for the depth, care, and honesty you brought into this space today. These are not easy conversations, and your willingness to share and reflect is deeply appreciated. I'd like to end with one final brief reflection from each panelist. For the interest of time, I will offer everyone the same question and I'll let you all go individually with your answer. But what intergenerational strength have you inherited? Munira, would you like to start? You're on my screen.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, what I really feel I've inherited is resilience, like the ability to adapt, rebuild, and keep going even after immense loss. And remembering that strength helps me trust that healing is possible. So I think that's one of the pieces that I've really acknowledged as a strength that I've inherited.
For me, it's my badass nannies and daddies that I think I try to honor, and I think about how involved they were in their community in their philanthropy in connecting and bringing people together. So that's something that I try to do in my life as well.
I can go next. I think for me, it's the ability to ask for help whenever I need it. Like for instance, around like a week ago, I actually made the decision to get out of a very abusive relationship. And it did take me a lot of courage to do so, but I was able to like ask help from like therapists, mental health clinicians, and even like religious leaders on how I can like navigate this situation because there was a lot of like religious abuse that was present in that relationship. And so I think like asking for help is something that I was able to kind of inherit from my previous generations.
For me, I would say the constant striving to be able to self-improve, whether it's for myself or for or when it comes to breaking cycles for myself and the generations after me, because I saw, being that my parents are immigrants and the only people in their immediate family that immigrated, they did just that, even if me and them don't always agree on certain things, and even if there are some certain cycles that they broke, but not all.
And for me, it's to see the humanity in everyone because we're all people. We've all gone through so many things, and we're all the product of all our life experiences put together. And even if others don't recognize our humanity, we don't have to return that to them. We can still accept these are people. We're all imperfect by nature, and we can freely embrace who we are without guilt, without shame, just be our authentic selves without apology.
I love all of those responses. Thank you all so much for those reflections. I hope everyone listening can take a moment to notice what resonated for them, whether it's a word, a feeling, or even a memory. Before we sign off, I'd like to invite us into a brief grounding breath together. I know we've had a pretty heavy conversation, so if you feel comfortable, please gently place your feet on the floor and take a slow breath in through your nose and a long breath out through your mouth. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for holding space for yourselves and for one another. We're grateful to our panelists and to everyone who joined us today. Please take care of yourselves, and we hope to continue these conversations together. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and thank you again.
Thank you.